All right, this is SIG Auth for January 11th. We have a relatively light agenda. We're going to be talking about RBAC v1 Beta 1 and the rollout that we are currently performing for various sundry to convert things. So we're using RBAC and enforcing conversion. So we have as a goal for 1.6 to get RBAC to v1 Beta 1. The biggest requirement we had for doing that was to enforce roles in EDE, to have a reasonable set of default roles that will actually work for a cluster to operate with RBAC enabled, and then documentation to describe to users how they can actually make use of a secured system when they're used to making it secure. We are on that road, so there's now a poll open to actually create the v1 Beta 1 version of the API. There are a few noteworthy changes in that poll. The biggest one is the attributes restrictions field. It's on a policy rule. It is something that we regretted doing at OpenShift. We ported over to RBAC, but never actually found a use for. So we are removing that dead field, pulled the crossed out, and then otherwise we are just copying the API over. The only other pertinent change went in several weeks ago was removing the RBAC super user in favor of using system masters, since we set that up for a loopback connection. And in 1.5, that group has a separate authorizer that ensures someone can have access to the system. The poll looks like already referenced there. If someone wants to make comments in it, it almost merged today. We have to do a few GKE Switzerland things. Hopefully CJ Coleman isn't too upset at the way that went last night, and he'll give us another try. And we'll be looking to do that sometime in the next week or so. Any questions or concerns just in general on the move to beta plan? All right, so in terms of the rollout, at the very beginning of this year, January 3rd, I think, 4th, right around there, we actually started enforcing RBAC inside of EDE. There is no more ABAC authorizers being used during those tests, and this ensures that we have working kubelet roles, working controller roles, working proxy roles, that the stock roles are actually being exercised, and that no one can actually merge their controller or kubelet or proxy changes and get through an EDE test without having those roles set up. This was a big boon for them. It has gone remarkably smoothly. There have been, I think, maybe 4 fix-ups already that people have noted. But if you're watching SIG Auth and you see it mentioned and you see concerns about a 403 from a controller, we need to try to make sure we guide people to the appropriate spots. I sent out something to Kubernetes Dev that provided links for where you need to change the code for controllers and for kubelets and where questions should go. I will copy a link into this agenda so that we all have it. But it's pretty straightforward to do with the way that the bootstrapping is done. There's just a file to list out all the different Bootstrap roles. They're keyed by the controller names, and we should be able to move that forward as well. Jordan has been very busily pasting in links. So, Jordan, do you want to go ahead and pick up where I left off there?
Sure. So there are basically 2 categories of things we're looking for. One is a set of Bootstrap roles and role grants or role bindings that are used by default system components, so the kube proxy, and by all nodes, and by the controllers that are running in the controller manager. Basically things where if you bring the system up, it is using internal names and groups, and we can bind those roles to those groups by default. That's one set of permissions. The second set of permissions are things that particular deployments use. So in a particular E2E test, for example, it might expect a service account in the namespace foo to have admin permissions. And so we don't want to grant a service account named foo, or a service account in a namespace foo, permissions in every deployment. In a case like that, the particular E2E test needs to set up permissions as part of its setting up the environment for its test. That can either be done in the test itself, or it can be documented that if you're using an external authorizer in order to run this end-to-end test, here's the permissions that need to be in place. That was largely just assumed. It was assumed that all service accounts were root on the cluster. And so, as David said, going ahead and enforcing and actually enumerating the permissions that we need in E2E was a big jump forward. And so that's basically the two categories we're kind of putting issues into. Is this a global thing that all deployments should have? Then it should go in Bootstrap roles and role bindings. Is it a particular issue with a particular script, like one of the GCE bring up scripts or cops bringing something up? Then we need to grant permission to a particular user in that script. And so that's how we're categorizing things and what we're trying to do. So again, if you see issues or you're having issues, report them on GitHub, tag in SIG Auth, David, myself, CJ, and we'll work through it. I think the thing that I've been running into the most is scripts that are serving double duty, that are being used to bring up environments that are used for E2E, and are also apparently being used by things like KubeUp and production deployments. And so right now, the bring up scripts are loading a set of default roles and role bindings for E2E in particular, but I think we actually want to limit that to just the E2E runs. So that's the bring up stuff. The second question is what to do with upgrades. So if you're upgrading a cluster using your own deployment methodology, or you are just upgrading the binary and running it, invoking it the same way, ABAC is still present and still works the same way it did. So if you have a policy that you're happy with, the 1.6 will work identically with that policy. But if you are wanting to use one of the GCE or GKE scripts that was switched to RBAC, we need to think through how do we upgrade a cluster that was brought up with the same corresponding script in 1.5. And so I linked, I'll copy a link actually. One of those issues is talking about what to do with upgrades. My preference would be to optionally include the legacy policy. I don't really want to duplicate the legacy policy in RBAC because the legacy policy was not a good policy. It made service accounts cluster admin. And so I think if you are upgrading from an old cluster and you want to keep an unenforcing policy in place, that should be possible, but that shouldn't be the default. And I don't really want to propagate that loose of a policy into RBAC. CJ, do you have any insight to, I guess, the couple scripts that we've been working with so far that we switched to RBAC, how those are being used, or do we know?
What do you mean by how those are being used?
So they're used for E2E. Is that because those scripts are what KubeUp uses, and so anyone who's using KubeUp picks up those?
Yep.
Okay.
And probably kube push, maybe.
Okay. So I think the pull 39537 is the first step, making it so that the admin user or the Cube user that people have already been using as their Bootstrap user will be in the super users group. So that if you use those bring up scripts and then started running kube control commands, those will continue to work as they did before. Right now, those scripts are loading policies for E to E, and I think we probably want to make the E to E runs make you specifically indicate that you want the E to E policies to pick up those, because those are not intended to be applied to all production instances.
Right.
And then the third aspect would be the upgrade scenario, where if you previously used KubeUp and you run it again, having a way to indicate that I want to load an old ABAC policy file. We're not going to generate a new one for you, but if you have a working cluster, you should be able to say, and load the old policy file that I had for my old cluster. We need to think through how to do that. If we want to detect if the file exists, I don't know how many of these things are being run by other tools or if they're being run by users directly. So we just need to figure out how to do that.
So you said we're not going to be generating a new one for you. What if I really don't care for my toy cluster and I just want everything to be wide open?
So I would expect that to either be something that you start up your cluster and then grant a permission that gives everyone access. So you can use kube control create cluster role binding and grant cluster admin to all your service accounts. You could do that if you want. You could script that if you want. I don't think that should be the default anymore.
I don't think so either, and I think we need to actively push people away from that. I just figured it might be easier to have some get out of jail flag that basically did exactly what 1.5 does. It will, if you're creating a new cluster, it'll write that ABAC file and it'll turn on the ABAC authorizer along with the RBAC authorizer, and you can do what you need with that.
Well, if we were going to do that, I would do it in RBAC so it could at least be dynamic. I don't want to generate ABAC anymore. The only reason I see to do ABAC is to preserve policies that people have already written in ABAC that they want to, that they need to pull in.
So when I say generate ABAC, I'm really talking about the couple dynamic pieces that are like my basic auth user and my whole system service accounts group and maybe something else.
Are you talking about the CSV password file and the token file? Because that's on the auth side. We're still generating those.
Yeah, so some of your stuff will make it so that those now appear in group masters, and maybe that'll be enough. I was just concerned that maybe we're blocking. Yeah, I don't know. I'll see.
I think we have to optionally include legacy ABAC policy because people have customized those, right? They've added to those, and so I think we have to do that. I would be in favor of documenting how to relax security, but I don't. I kind of want to make people do it themselves. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah.
Yeah, we find that ABAC and RBAC don't play particularly well together in terms of like practically having, it's like ABAC is really good for the bootstrapping initially, but in reality, it's way easier to just use RBAC all the way through because you get weird scenarios like you get limitations around the, like you get privilege escalation, you hit the privilege escalation checks pretty quickly because like the authorizers don't play well together.
Oh, actually, I should mention that. So anyone who has been using RBAC, if you use multiple authorizers together, this is what Eric was just talking about, when you try to grant a role in RBAC, it makes sure that you already have all the permissions granted in RBAC so that you can't escalate yourself or someone else's permissions via sort of circular grants. Like I'll grant you a role that gives you power and then you grant the role back to me, that kind of thing. A pull just went in that allows alternately gating that on a particular permission, and any authorizer can give you that permission. So this will let you bootstrap with ABAC or a webhook authorizer or something else, and then that can vouch for you that you have permission to bind a particular role. So that just went in. I'll link in the poll. That's an aside. That's not related to the rollout.
Yeah, thanks for doing that. That was, I guess partially requested by me because we need a way to bootstrap RBAC bindings from user configured GCP IAM permissions.
Yeah, and there are other, even if you were just dealing with RBAC, like it can be useful to have a role which is allowed to grant other roles. And that's all I can do. That's all it's intended to do. And even though that doesn't really prevent you from escalating that role, it's useful to segment those permissions just from like a fat finger perspective. Like this controller's job is to grant roles, and that's it. And so why give it permission to hit any other API? So. So I don't have a lot more to report on the rollout stuff. I've got a couple of pulls in flight to triage some of those upgrade scripts or rollout scripts, and then we'll start looking at the upgrade scenarios next.
All right, I think that's all we had planned to cover. Are there other topics people are burning to discuss?
I mean, there were some concerns. I saw the Tim Hawken commented on one of the SIG Auth Google group that there were some concerns about the documentation of RBAC and turning it on by default. I don't know. Yeah.
I think that's like those, if we're going to make changes to the defaults, users often get unhappy if they happen by surprise. And so I think the open questions here is if we're going to make changes for 1.6, to the extent that we can let people know what is coming and they can plan for it rather than discovering it on 1.6 release day, those are, and the doc part of is separate, I think, from that. But also good.
Yeah, I think the scope of the changes was we thought we were changing the default for the E to E, and knowing that this one script is used from a bunch of different places in a bunch of different ways is concerning. It makes it difficult to move forward without being disruptive. So that's what we're trying to figure out.
And I think users are open to guidance here, right? I mean, they don't want to have to go read 50 different docs or lots of stuff to figure out how to configure it securely. If we have like the security best practices guide of here's like how you should use RBAC, depart from this based on your extensive security knowledge because you know what you're doing, I think that helps a lot. Or are you hearing different things about, like, are they asking for more reference docs about RBAC, or are they asking more like, I don't want to know or care?
My guess is it's people who used to be able to use KubeUp and then their admin user was a super user, and that's no longer the case. And so we're fixing some of those things, right? The environments where people didn't actually have control over the ABAC policy file, I think we can make it reasonably painless and transparent. It's the environments where people did have control over the ABAC policy that we are trying to figure out. And if it looks like enable RBAC, and if we detect that there's a legacy ABAC policy, also include that and log, hey, we included ABAC because you have it in place. Here's a reference to how you migrate off of it. I think a lot more people would not really care. It's the people who have workflows that are using the kube scripts that were affected.
Yeah, I think you raised a couple of good points there. One is like the users using kube up on 1.6 who had a workflow that worked on 1.5. And the other one is, of course, people upgrading from 1.5 to 1.6 where they have an existing cluster and existing all that stuff. And is that upgrade going to break them? Like they're just changed the binaries.
No, ABAC is still there. It still works as it did in 1.5.
Our internal experience, though, turning on RBAC for a lot of the CoreOS clusters is that so many developers are used to clusters developing against clusters that don't have authorization, that it basically, it breaks everything. I routinely get people with, smart people who work with Kubernetes every day coming up to me and saying, hey, everything is broken, what the hell? And it seems like from a documentation standpoint or even a learning standpoint, it's like suddenly pretty much every job that uses, everything that could possibly be deployed that uses the Kubernetes API, like an ingress controller or something like that, suddenly becomes a surface area for somebody being confused and being frustrated with the new technologies. So I don't know exactly what the best way of combating that is, but it's just I think the major complaint that I see is that just not enough people know how to use RBAC or understand what the general way to use it is or the patterns. So they become frustrated very, very quickly with it.
So you're saying a user's guide to it is useful, but a developer's guide is also useful. Or
we have a guide, and I think that it's useful, but I think just the fact that it's not very we in this SIG understand these concepts very well, but I think outside externally, not many people are playing around with really customized authentication or authorization practices. People who set up clusters where they have lots of tenants that, even if it's just your coworkers is one thing, but I think a lot of people are just using Minikube or using whatever scripts that they have that don't enforce any authentication or authorization, or they give you an X11 insert that never expires, which is, I think that is the majority of the developer experience, and turning on RBAC largely means that anybody developing something that uses a service account to talk to the API now has to write a custom RBAC profile for their application, which is the correct thing, absolutely, but it's also just, I think it's going to cause frustration if more people don't understand how the system works.
So do you have proposals on how to address that? I mean, I could imagine make it easier to have root in cluster as an RBAC profile, to work around it as a temporary thing. I could imagine, better, I don't know what I'd imagine. But
yeah, I mean, our workaround is generally, our temporary workaround is sometimes here's the binding that gives you the admin role for your Surface account, which is bad. I don't know generally what the correct way of educating.
Right. I mean, I think that for a use case of I want to hack a Raspberry Pi demo together using Minikube as quick as possible, that's a reasonable use case. And I don't think using admin token is necessarily, your role is bad in that case because your goals are really constrained and there's no plans to ever productionize, right? Now, in other scenarios, maybe it is bad to have that as an encouraged flow.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't have great answers in terms of this, but I think it's reasonable to need to. Maybe it is, reviewing our documentation to try to make it better. Maybe it has to be writing more blog posts on the Kubernetes blog for introducing this feature to more people.
What's our education plan?
Right. Yeah. I think that's the better way of putting it.
Anyone else have thoughts?
Just that some of these things are just exposing things that were broken in some clusters already, which is painful, but also helpful. It's strong medicine, but someone who writes a component and that is intended to be broadly consumable in any Kubernetes deployment and doesn't consider the permissions, the API permissions they require. It's unfortunate that we've made it this far without people having to consider that. And so I just kind of framing this as a good thing. Like, this isn't something that was working before and is now not working. This is something that maybe worked before, but you never knew. It depended on what cluster your app was deployed to. And so just kind of framing this as this is the other half of API usage, like figuring out the APIs you want to use and then making sure that you're running as someone authorized to use those.
It's crazy we got this far without that.
I think this is an important point, is when you explain what's going on to users, the why we're making the change is as important as the how and the what.
Yep.
And like, to the extent that if we have like a security roadmap plan of like where we're driving things and why that justifies what we're doing, we could potentially refer people to that, and that might also serve some of the proactive education of like, hey, community security isn't really there and we need it to be, and we're going to do that in 2017, and here's what's coming and why.
Yeah.
Anyone up for next steps or proposing something or stepping up for something? Yeah.
It seems a daunting task, to be honest.
So what can we do to rescope then to something that is achievable, that's low cost, and does something for 1.6? Like, what's our min bar for 1.6, and does it have to land pre 1.6?
It feels something tangential to, or I don't know. I feel like reviewing our documentation would be a good place to start. And yeah, it is often very hard to review the documentation because I know it so well. Yeah.
And I think in order to switch to RBAC as the default and turn off all the other stuff, it does seem reasonable that we hold our users' hands through the process. As a
maybe, I mean, I know that as part of releases, we have blog posts that go out describing particular features. Maybe we can commit to one of those at the very least. You know, here's the RBAC thing that we just enabled, and here's sort of how to use it, and here's how to get started, and here's why we're doing it.
I started documentation that describes the default roles, how we expect people to use it. It's not a far stretch for me to go ahead and continue that for so you started a cluster and now it's telling you can't do anything. What should you do?
I could even see an option to say run insecurely, but I would not want any of our E2Es or CI machines to run that way. So for someone who needs a cluster to behave the same way it did in 1.5, and with big nasty warnings around the run insecure option, I don't think I would want them to handcraft that. It should just be I'm running insecure like 1.5 and I don't care.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think we need
the key that I want to emphasize is that we not run any CI or E2E that way. So if we're eating our own dog food for a controlled cluster and we give users coming from 1.5 an out, I don't know.
Unless it's the explicit test that the out still works E2E.
Well, granting additional permissions will I don't know. I think some of the EDEs should test denials, and those won't work if you're in too permissive of a cluster.
Sorry, my point is, if we document, here's our officially supported workaround to get whatever, we should have, make sure there's an EDE that covers that official workaround directly or indirectly. So, but yes, I agree with you that like making sure the docs is important too. Yeah, so from GKE standpoint, we need to be backwards compatible with all of the other clusters that are already out there. We can't inflict this without notice on users. Like, sorry, all of your stuff breaks. So we will, I care about having a backwards compat mode at least. And happy to put in whatever we need to do to make that happen. So
yeah, I think that was Jordan's point of if your cluster already has an ABAC policy, it would go ahead and honor the ABAC policy.
Well, there are two aspects. One is upgrading an actual existing cluster. And so that needs to keep working as is. The second is bringing up a new 1.6 cluster, expecting it to behave the same as 1.5. That's if you've got your workloads that you're running on your cluster, and they're using the API to do all sorts of things, and they're assuming they have full permissions, and the correct thing to do is to break out the permissions required per component and grant those and do all these things. But this person was using 1.5 and they were happy, and they want to use 1.6 and they are sad. And either setting up the policies that they would need and telling them, go load them this way and this will get you 1.5 behavior, and here's the trade-offs. Or I think that would be the minimum. But yeah.
I think also practically how a lot of people deploy Kubernetes clusters from what we've seen is that they use tools like kops or whatever else.
Right.
We have like a million internally. And I think that the general feedback for me going to like one of our deployment methods has been, well, RBAC's in alpha, therefore we don't want to endorse it for every Kubernetes cluster that we spin up. I think that we'll get a lot of good feedback if we sort of, as we push deployment methods to start using RBAC on. Because like whether or not the API server has it on by default, I think the real test is does kops, does kubadmin, does whatever, does minikube use it, right? These type of things would be, I think that those type of things will be a good test of what does it look like when we do turn this on, and what are the types of frictions that we experience.
Yeah.
I don't think we can make an alpha thing the default. That seems a little odd. So moving it at least to beta, or if not GA, like as part of that, like we are moving it to GA and making it the default is a reasonable story, I think. Is that the plan?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, ABAC is, the API version is beta also. So yes, the goal is beta for 1.6. API-wise and correctness-wise, it's in a good place. I think the remaining issues that we wanted to look at were performance and like documentation and tooling around it, and some of the like upgrade scenarios. Like you upgrade and some new roles exist. How do those roles get added in? You upgrade and a component, it requires some additional permissions. How does the role for that component get updated? So it's sort of the ecosystem around the API itself before GA.
Do we have significant gaps with regards to that versus ABAC? I mean, I guess there it's you can have everything, so done. Or
I mean, ABAC is just the policy file. So in that sense, RBAC is just the API today. So they have parity.
Right.
The reason we notice those needs, though, is because the ABAC policy says allow everything. And when you say allow everything, you're not likely to need to add additional permissions in the future.
And so the open question is, like, are we going to piss off our users if we make this the default because they don't have enough tooling to actually make it work for their use cases and needs?
I think it can definitely be made to work. There are helper commands to be able to find roles. We have docs that have started for what roles exist out of the box. The reconciliation on startup to be sure that the controllers and kubelets and all those work out of the box is a solved problem in OpenShift. We can bring that same style solution up in Kubernetes so that your cluster will automatically add the system pieces that we need. System prefixes and authentication and authorization have existed since 1.0, as this is owned by the cluster and updates will be made. So I think that is all reasonable to do and achievable for a fairly smooth transition.
Okay, thank you.
All right, there's a lot of additional docs and some more steps to be done for the rollout. I will start writing a doc that is a more prescriptive how-to based on the doc pool I've already started for default roles and basic bootstrapping for how you actually find your roles, how we anticipate you using the system. I'll definitely have those done, at least draft before the next meeting.
We do have a bunch of interest internally at Google to help make this space better. Is it reasonable to take a new to Kubernetes person and add them to here where they would be useful, or is that more overhead than benefit?
Actually, doc reviews from that kind of a perspective, like Eric Chang was saying, doc reviews from that kind of perspective are very useful. I want to do X and I can't figure out how.
Yeah, and live doc reviews. You have the doc in one side of the screen and your terminal on the other side, and you're actually following the steps and bringing something up. And yeah, that's helpful.
If you've got a name and want to throw them in this doc, I will definitely start tagging them in.
I don't yet, right? This is somebody new to the project, so they wouldn't even, ramping up to Kubernetes and so on takes a while too. So, but actually maybe there is someone on our security team I could pull out. Jacob Simpson looks like he's volunteering on the chat. Maybe Chris Hawk too. I'll see if he's up for something.
Great.
And Kevin G. What a deal. Thank you.
All right. Does anyone have something else? I definitely feel like I have plenty to do coming out of this. This is going to be my victory lap. All right. Jordan, you got anything else?
No, not for today.
Eric, CJ, Alex.
That's all. Thank you so much.
That's all I got. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
All right, guys. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording, and I'll see you all in a couple weeks. I will keep you up to date on the doc polls in particular, and can I tag you as well, Alex?
Sure. Or NCJ.
NCJ. All right. Thanks. Bye, guys.